Hello everyone and welcome to our second lecture here in Unit 17 on the Renaissance and Reformation. In the first lecture we took a look at the beginnings of the Renaissance and where it started in Italy, and now we're going to talk about the Northern Renaissance. So we're going to talk about how it spread from Italy into the rest of Europe. Alright, one thing I'd like you guys to do before you begin though is take a second here, pause this lecture, and then actually look at this painting. What do you see? What do you notice about the two men that are in the picture? And what do you notice that's with them and around them in this painting? All right, so pause it here for a second. All right, guys, I hope you saw a lot in this painting, whether it's the two figures themselves to the stuff that's on the table. And I want you to notice where that stuff is from, where did it, what does it do, and so forth. There's a lot there. And there's also a real special thing as well. If you didn't notice, at the very bottom of the screen, there is a skeleton here in kind of a distorted image. And that is on purpose. And that was done on purpose by the painter of this painting. All right, so let's get into the Northern Renaissance. All right, so let's set the stage just like we did in the first lecture. So remember, we have all these different Renaissance artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo. They all are trying to do these things. They're trying to build an interest in classical culture. So the focus mainly back onto the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. They're showing the curiosity that's being developed about the world during this period, kind of the idea of asking questions, seeing what's there, and achieving and seeing what the world actually is. And there's that belief in human potential. And that's really important. All these ideas are actually going to transition themselves to the Northern Renaissance as well. But there's one thing I want to mention here before I forget, just in case I don't mention it in the lecture, is that there is a huge difference between Renaissance art and thinking in Italy versus the rest of Europe or in the Northern Renaissance. And the big thing there is that you're going to see there's more of in the Italian Renaissance, even though they are focused more on the classical world and even secular things, you're going to see more of kind of a mixture of worldly and religious topics and subjects in their pieces of art. Whereas in the Northern Renaissance, it's going to be more secular and about everyday things. As you see here in this painting here, it's more of an everyday picture, an everyday scene that you're seeing in this art. All right, now remember, Renaissance writers and artists and other people, they expanded upon the ideas of individuality. Again, it's all about humanism, it's all about the human potential, it's all about individual achievement. Now, how does this spread, the Renaissance spread? It has everything to do with visiting scholars, merchants, and students to Italy, and people that end up leaving Italy and go to the rest of Europe. And that in itself will lead to the Renaissance spreading to the rest of Europe. All right, so here's the beginnings. So in the 1450s, we are seeing the end of the plague and the end of the 100 Years' War, just like we talked about within last lecture about the beginnings of the Renaissance in Italy. So we see a population growth. And specifically here, we see people flocking to cities because that's where jobs are, that's where opportunities are, that's where people can gain freedom from the breakdown of feudalism. So we see cities growing rapidly. With this growth in the cities, we see an increase in trade. From there, we see merchants starting to sponsor artists. Again, nothing new. Those are patrons. We talked about that within Italy. But where does this start in Northern Europe? In particular, it starts in Flanders. This area here that we kind of consider ourselves we know this area is in Belgium today. And it starts in Flanders because of not only was it a focal point of trade, but in particular, there was a specific industry there that was flourishing, and that was the textile or cloth industry. Now, Northern Europe is going to be different from what we see in Italy because Italy is dominated by actual individual city-states. In Northern Europe, it's dominated by unified states themselves. Think of the Republic of Netherlands, England, France, these various kingdoms. And what ends up happening is, yes, the church is going to commission artists. There's going to be individual patrons or merchants that do commission art, but it's mostly going to be kings and higher up nobility here in Northern Europe that are actually going to hire artists to create stuff, or even they're going to be the ones that are purchasing it. So we start to see the Northern Renaissance ends up becoming essentially the Italian Renaissance, but they mix their own little traditions and their own little flares there, such as having who is actually the patrons and what they actually present in the art. All right, so as the artistic ideas spread, we see some changes here in the art that actually is going to be developed in the Northern Renaissance. So in 1494, the French launch an invasion of Italy. Now, what this does is actually creates an opportunity for art and ideas from the Renaissance to spread into the rest of Europe, because people flee the war, in particular Italian artists and scholars, and they end up going into Germany, France, England, and so forth. And where we see the artistic principles of the Renaissance spread to specifically are in Flanders, or in the Flemish area, and as well as into Germany. And there's a little bit of differences here. So we're going to talk about the German ones first. So German artists, they focused on realism and perspective, just like the Italian artists. We can see here in these paintings, there is a perspective idea. There's realistic principles here. But there is one key thing that is going to develop in terms of the art in this area, in the northern part of Europe, is they not only use realism and perspective, but they use oil paintings. Oil paint for their paintings. And this is important because it actually allows new techniques to be developed and new ways to layer paintings and so forth, like I talk about here with Jan van Eyck, who's the person that really champions this idea at first. And what this does is it allows kind of an even greater advancement upon painting using perspective and using realism. And you can see it here in these paintings that are on screen. This is actually Albrecht Dürer, who becomes the actual preeminent German painter of this period. And again, as I talked about in the last slide, Flanders was the area, the artistic center of Europe, because there's a lot of money. That means a lot of the greatest Renaissance, Northern Renaissance artists begin there or get their start there, such as Jan van Eyck and Pieter Bruegel. And they mainly focus on realism in everyday life and the use of rich colors in large groups to actually show out what's going on. And really the big difference between Jan van Eyck and Bruegel is that Van Eyck liked to kind of use subtle colors and textures with the oil painting, whereas Bruegel liked to use vivid colors and be rich in what he's showing. So there's a little bit of difference there. All right, so let's focus on Northern writers. And writers are very important in the Northern Renaissance for a variety of reasons. And really, the reason why they're important is because they actually focused on actually looking at church teachings. They were more critical of the church than what we see in Italy, at least in terms of, we did see in Italy they questioned stuff, but they weren't as critical. In the Northern Renaissance, we see that. And what ultimately this leads to is a mixture of the idea of humanism, individual human achievement, and its connection with the church and the criticisms and critical questions these writers were talking about. So this leads to the development of what's known as Christian humanism. And their focus is really on not only educating society, but reforming society to fit what's going on in the age, and making sure that these questionable ideas are moving forward. We start to see schools that are being founded not only for men, but women as well. So that's a huge change. And let's talk about these three that are on screen. We have Erasmus, who actually wrote of a pure, simple Christian life. So it's linking within religion. But he was questioning the actual positions of the church and the practices of the church. And he ended up fanning discontent against the church in terms of its practices, not against the religion, against the practices that were going on. So much so he was ended up being censored. Sir Thomas More, he criticized not only the church, but he specifically criticized the English government and the society. He's actually going to pay for that later. And he ended up writing a very important book known as the Utopia, which talks about this perfect, non-existent society that people should live in, or at least to strive to, and so forth. And then to not leave women out, even though there aren't that many that rise above their limitations in this period, we do have Christine de Pizan, who focused on talking and writing about the role of women in society, and she championed the idea that women should fight for equality and education. And this is kind of the big first female, suffragette that is championing equality in Europe. All right, so let's move on to the Elizabethan age. So now we're actually talking about specifically England. in the Northern Renaissance. And we'll talk more about England a little bit later in this unit as well in its regard to the Reformation. But for right now, in the mid-1500s, we see the Renaissance and its ideas spread to England. Now, Queen Elizabeth I, very important ruler in English history, the reason why the Renaissance takes off in England is because she was focused on learning. I mean, the lady knew 6 languages, and she wanted to support not only learning and advancements in literature, but she wanted to focus on advancements in the arts as well. And this is actually during the period that perhaps the most famous playwright in history lived, and there's no coincidence why he was able to develop what he did. It's because of the age, and it's William Shakespeare. And a few things you guys need to know about William Shakespeare. He displayed a Renaissance tendency by drawing inspiration in his stories from ancient classics, from the Greeks and the Romans, as well as contemporary pieces as well of his age. His plots aren't original. If you go look at what's going on in his stories, he's not talking about anything that's brand new. I mean, Romeo and Juliet, the idea behind that's not really a new concept, even in his day. But the treatments of what he does and how the story develops, that's where he's actually a master as a writer. And in his writings, in his plays, you can see that he displays not only an idea of the natural sciences and understanding of anatomy and humanist ideas and of individual achievement and rivalry and all that stuff, but that's very important in understanding the main themes. And you can see that he's a true Renaissance person because of just all the topics and all the stuff that he discusses in his work. His use of language, such as the vernacular and the ideas of themes, means that he becomes appealing to all, whether it's the nobility like Queen Elizabeth or the everyday commoner. And this is important because not only does this lead to his popularity, this leads to the expansion of the Renaissance ideas in England. And you have a mass audience that's now linked and actively seeking out culture. And London is going to be that stage. It's going to become the place in England. It's going to be this thriving city for culture and theater and Renaissance ideas and change in this period. All right, so now we're going to talk about perhaps the most important invention in history, at least in terms of learning. So let's go back a little bit. Let's think about what we talked about when we were visiting ancient China. And you have in the 13th century, block printing, which was an invention from China, reaches Europe through trade, whether it's across the Silk Road routes or through maritime trade, or partial maritime trade as well. But the European writing system is better suited to block printing. If you guys remember, in China, they actually have a pictographic or ideographic form of writing. Okay, they use symbols. Well, in Europe, we have our alphabetic style, and it's much easier because we have so much fewer characters than that of the Chinese language to actually use block printing. It's more practical. So what happens is in the mid-1400s, a German from Mainz, who's an inventor, is able to take this principle of block printing and use it within a machine that he develops. And he develops what's known as the first printing press. And this is important. And I don't have to ask you these questions or go over really what the printing press is and why it's important. It's pretty obvious. But remember, printing press in this stage, people before the printing press would have to handwrite books. Okay? Or if they were lucky enough to have block printing, they'd have to move them by themselves by hand. So it was very difficult to reproduce books, and which meant that learning was limited. And with the printing press, it makes not only books easier to print, it makes them cheaper, and then from that point you not only have more supply, but it's better priced, and it makes education more widely accessible to people. So what this does is it not only leads to explosion in the ideas of the Renaissance spreading across Europe, but the just explosion in learning and advancement. Now, the first books originally were religious. I mean, Gutenberg's true first printing was the Gutenberg Bible. That's absolutely massive. You can still go see it in Germany today. But soon as time developed, you do see travel guides, you see medical manuals, you see other books that start getting printed. And then when you combine this fact with that they're easier to print, more accessible, that majority of authors are now starting to write in the vernacular, you have more widespread access in general, just to understanding of learning and language and ideas to the everyday populace. All right, so this, guys, star this slide. This is very important. You need to know this one. We have the legacies of the Renaissance, or what are their immediate effects, or why it's an important event, whether it's in the Italian area or the scope of what we talked about today, the Northern Renaissance. We do see the changes in arts. We see techniques are drawn back on the classics from the Greeks and the Romans. We see depictions are more realistic. They're both secular, so non-religious and religious, depending on the topic and area that you're looking at. We see writers writing in the vernacular for the everyday language of people, and we see a recognition of individual achievement. We start seeing people become famous, like Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Not only that, we see changes in societies. We see printing creates a learning revolution, and perhaps the greatest revolution in world history, or at least arguably. We see a revolution leading to discoveries in other fields and other topics. So that's important. So advancements of so many different topics for learning, whether it's science, medicine, history, philosophy, whatever. We see laws becoming more clear because people can not only understand them, but they're more readily available, and then they also become more defined, so you have a better structure in society. You also see humanist ideas changing the idea of how people live, and that they can not only live to enjoy life, but they can actually live to advance and achieve things. And then we see people beginning to question politics, so we are going to start seeing changes in ideas of government, whether it's from transitions from feudalism to a more open society or to more democratic forms of government. And then they also start questioning religion, which means that we're going to have some transitions in the religious sector as well. Now, more on that in the second half of this unit. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.